Every villain worthy of his name needs its seat of power, space of operations, a fittingly formidable and impregnable location in which dastardly schemes are sure to be hatched. Fictional baddies have their Death Stars, their Mount Dooms, their LexCorps, their Latverias. But also real-life supervillains have laid out plans for super-secure bases where they could plan the largest land invasions in history and oversee the extermination of entire populations while dodging assassination attempts or enjoying tea and pastries with their secretaries. In today's episode of Places, we're going to travel to the most iconic military headquarters of the Third Reich, a sprawling maze of concrete bunkers nestled deeply into a swampy woodland. Welcome to the Wolf's Lair, Adolf Hitler's HQ on the Eastern Front. The Wolf's Lair, or in German Wolfschanze, was the largest of many headquarters used by Adolf Hitler and his military leadership throughout World War II. Each base fulfilled a specific function, in this case, directing Operation Barbarossa from as close as possible to the Eastern Front. Now, we'll not go into the details of the largest invasion of history. For those, you can absolutely refer to our War of Graphics video on the same topic. The invasion of Stalin's Soviet Union, it began on June the 22nd, 1941, but military planners had been hard at work since the previous summer. Nazi Germany and Moscow were formally allies, according to the Ribbentrop-Molotov non-aggression pact. But Adolf Hitler was never one to allow a piece of paper to get in the way of his goals. As part of the preparations in the summer of 1940, he instructed his Minister for Armaments and Munitions, Engineer Fritz Todt, with a delicate mission, building a secure forward base from which the dictator and his generals could plan their operations. Todt set off to East Prussia, in an area some 80 kilometers from the Soviet border. As a reminder, back then the Soviet Union stretched well into modern-day Poland following the latter country's invasion by the two totalitarian powers. Todt and his adjutant, Captain Engel, identified a promising site deep inside the forest of Gorlitz, 8 kilometers east of Rastenburg, today the Polish town of Kętrzyn. Todt and Engel's main concern was security. The location had to be well protected from both land and air attacks, and the Gorlitz forest fit the bill. It was shielded to the east by the Masurian Lake System, a 70-kilometer-long natural barrier against armored divisions. If that wasn't enough, the area was already heavily garrisoned by several barracks and military installations, including 4 fortresses, anti-tank trenches, and lines of barbed wire fences. Another consideration was that the area was sparsely populated and traversed by only a small network of roads. This would make it very easy to control movements in and out of the future base, as well as to maintain secrecy around its construction. Hitler liked the idea, and on November 15th, 1940, ordered the construction of the base that later became known as the Wolf's Lair. Fritz Todt and his state-owned firm, Organisation Todt, began work in earnest. To maintain secrecy, the building plans were conducted under the pretense of laying out a factory, the Ascania Chemical Works. This cover allowed Organisation Todt to order building material from unsuspecting contractors such as concrete structures and ventilation systems from all over Germany. Next, Todt recruited his workforce, estimated to be between 2,000 and 5,000 workers. Now, Organisation Todt was infamous for exploiting forced labor throughout the war, but according to the curators of the Wolf's Lair archaeological and touristic site, no sources confirmed that slave labor was employed at the site. It appears instead that the builders were a professional, paid workforce. Each one of them was thoroughly vetted by the RSD, that's the Reich Security Service, itself part of the SS. And to maintain secrecy, workers' brigades were frequently rotated in and out of the Gorlitz forest. These builders started their work by clearing the forest of all buildings and inhabitants within a forbidden zone, 10 kilometers in radius. The zone was then surrounded by barbed wire fences, camouflaged watchtowers, trenches, wooden barracks, and a minefield 150 meters wide. Then the workforce laid out dozens of buildings, sturdy, squat structures built in wood, concrete, and brick, with windows shielded by steel shutters. The 10 main bunkers were entirely concrete, with walls and roofs a meter thick, designed to resist the impact of half-ton bombs. Their doors were thick with steel, obviously, and lined with rubber seals to prevent poisonous gases from seeping in. Work at the site never really stopped, even after its inauguration, with added layers of protection added up until 1944. By the end of the war, all buildings at the Wolf's Lair were protected by 4-meter-thick shells made of concrete, steel, and sand or basalt to absorb the shock of explosions. These reinforced structures were described in awe by Traudl Hunger, one of Hitler's secretaries, quoting here, "Instead of the low-built little bunkers, heavy colossal structures of concrete and iron rose above the trees. There was nothing to be seen from above. Grass had been planted on the flat rooftops. Trees grew from the concrete, some of them real and some artificial, and from the plain you would have thought the forest stretched on unbroken." The general layout of the headquarters included some 80 buildings, covering an area of 6.5 square kilometers, arranged along 3 concentric security zones. This outer perimeter was surrounded by land and fencing, and defended by an armored unit of the Heer, or Land Army. This was the Führer Beglied Battalion, or FBB. A force of 1,277 men distributed across trenches, watchtowers, and checkpoints. These guys clearly meant business, but even before facing them, an attacker would have to negotiate sparse, narrow roads protected by outward gun emplacements, to say nothing of the swampy land surrounding the Masurian lakes. These swamps surely added to the defenses of the HQ, but caused endless misery amongst Todd's workers as they were infested by ferocious mosquitoes. Only in June of 1941, when initial work was almost completed, Todd called for an exterminator to deal with the problem, but apparently failed miserably. Years later, in 1943, a second attempt at eradication was carried out by pouring gallons upon gallons of kerosene into the swamps. The solution worked, at least at the beginning, as it killed off all the larvae of the mosquitoes, but it also exterminated the local population of frogs. Eventually, the mosquitoes made a comeback with a vengeance, causing the fury of the Führer. Apparently, he ranted, "Have you seen idiots like that? They got rid of the frogs, the mosquitoes stayed. The frogs catch thousands of mosquitoes every day." Well, what can we say? Hitler knew a thing or two about extermination. But back to our security zones. The second inner circle of the Wolf's Lair was the aptly named Security Zone 2. Here, Todd had placed the bunkers of the Armed Forces Joint Staff and the officers of the Commandant of the base, Lieutenant Colonel Gustav Struve. The personnel here had access to their own dining and accommodation facilities and were not subjected to additional levels of security. Their main job was to digest reports from all theaters of war to then be forwarded to Hitler and his most senior officers at the site, General Alfred Jodl and Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel. The innermost circle was Security Zone 1. This area was secured by a steel fence and guarded by 2 units, both belonging to the SS, the RSD, the security service, and the Begleitkommando des Führers. That was Hitler's personal bodyguard. Security Zone 1 contained 11 buildings, including the Führer bunker and bunkers for Hitler's closest collaborators, such as Private Secretary Martin Bormann, as well as Hermann Göring, Jodl, and Keitel. The security measures described thus far were clearly designed to fend off a land invasion or deter daring assassination attempts. But what of attacks from the air? The high-rising trees of the Görlitz forest contributed in part to shielding the squat buildings of the HQ from aerial reconnaissance, but the forest was only 2 kilometers in width, and some patches had to be cleared of trees to make room for the buildings. Hence, such patches had to be covered with camouflage nets stretching from one bunker to the next. The buildings themselves had to be cleverly camouflaged as well, similar to what we described earlier. They were not placed parallel to each other, nor at right angles, a ploy which maintains the natural appearance of the woodlands if observed from above. Then, the walls of the installations were covered in a mixture of seagrass and green dye to give them a more natural tint. Finally, the roofs were topped by a layer of 30 centimeters of soil on which a gardening company from Stuttgart planted shrubs, grass, and even artificial trees. But to be on the safe side, the site was protected also by an anti-aircraft regiment who took position on June 6, 1941. This set of precautions worked a treat, as the HQ was never seriously targeted by the Allies' bombers. Indeed, it appears the Soviet Air Force was not even aware of its existence. But the Western Allies, through their code-breaking and communications interception, knew about the location of Hitler's largest headquarters. The British Royal Air Force and later US Army Air Force considered the option of dropping a blockbuster bomb on the base, but they had no certainty of when the facility would actually be occupied by the Führer and his acolytes, plus the mission would carry too many risks. It could only be accomplished by the heaviest bombers at such a distance to outrange fighter escorts, thus multiplying the chances for horrible losses. 2 weeks later, on June the 22nd, Barbarossa kicked off, and on the 24th, Hitler arrived at his new Rastenburg headquarters on his special armored train, the America. Upon arriving, the Führer himself chose a catchy nickname for the base. The name Adolf in Old High German means noble wolf. Hence, in his early political days, the Führer would use the alias Herr Wolf. It made narcissistic sense then to dub the HQ Wolfschanze. By the way, Schanze in German means entrenchment, so a correct translation would be the wolf's entrenchment. But I think you'll agree that the Wolf's Lair has a bit of a more sinister ring to it. From 1941 to 1944, Hitler spent a total of 800 days at his lair, longer than in any of his other many HQs. All witnesses agreed that the tyrant conducted a very modest lifestyle, living in rather Spartan conditions within the Führer bunker. The dictator's apartment consisted of a study, a briefing room, bedroom, toilet with shower, and quarters for his servants. Hitler's valet, Heinz Lynch, was not surprised by the sparse decor. To quote him, "If a stranger to Wolfschanze did not know better and saw Hitler's bedroom with its military-issue field bed, he would have thought it to be the dormitory of a subaltern." Hitler's bedroom later received an upgrade and was furnished with some extra items. A crate for Hitler's German shepherd Blondie to sleep in, a gramophone blaring out Strauss, Beethoven, and Wagner, and a single bookshelf which held 2 lonely tomes on stomach disease. Besides the apartment we described, the Führer bunker hosted a maze of smaller rooms and corridors populated by Hitler's 4 secretaries, his bodyguards, and adjutants. For security reasons, the windows were small and seldom opened, hence oxygen had to be fed through pipes from canisters buried outside. The routine inside the Führer bunker was, of course, dictated by the habits of the big man in charge. Hitler opened his eyes at 10 a.m. when Linz showed up for wakey wakey. The dictator then had a light breakfast, mostly warm milk with rye bread, oatmeal, or muesli. 10:30 a.m., an adjutant handed in the morning briefing, consisting of personal mail and news clippings curated by Minister of Foreign Affairs von Ribbentrop. The morning continued with a military report delivered by Hitler's generals in a dedicated map room. Next, Hitler followed the orders of his private physician, Dr. Morrell, and went for a relaxing stroll with Blondie. It seems like Hitler greatly enjoyed this me time with his beloved Blondie, teaching her all sorts of tricks and acrobatics. What he did not enjoy was the company of other humans, and even bodyguards were instructed to watch him at a distance lest they be seen. Blondie was not the only star pet at Wolf's Lair, as in 1942, the HQ's garrison adopted a cat called Peter. The Führer had a dislike for cats, but he eventually warmed up to the feline, becoming jealous if it sat on someone else's lap. Blondie and Peter were later joined by an unnamed young deer, a favorite with the RSD. Trooper Rochus Misch was apparently more preoccupied with the woodland animal than with his boss, quoting him, "Besides Hitler, we also had time to look after a young roe fawn which came to us one day. We fed it peanuts, and the crafty animal soon knew exactly where we kept these and was soon helping itself. It would also come up the steps to the hut, push open the door with its snout, and lick up the peanuts from the floor. We would leave the door open intentionally, and often the fawn would come up to our beds for assistance if it failed to find what it was looking for." Unsurprisingly, Hitler was way more fussy than the fawn when it came to food. His bunker was equipped with a dedicated kitchen where meals would be cooked by an Austrian dietitian, Helene von Exner. His cooking was a favorite of the dictator, that is until the RSD found out that she had a Jewish grandmother and was dismissed in May 1944. But while Exner was in charge, she took care of preparing strictly vegetarian meals using produce grown at Hitler's alpine retreat, the Berghof. The fruit and veg imported from Bavaria were of good quality, but most importantly, they were grown under strict supervision, thus reducing the risk of poisoning. Such risk was further minimized by the employment of Margot Velk and 14 other young female tasters. Velk recalled how she and her colleagues had to taste Hitler's meals every day between 11 a.m. and noon. Lunch was served only at 2 p.m., thus allowing some time to spot the symptoms of poisoning. Margot also gave a glimpse on the type of food served at the Wolf's Lair, quoting her, "There was asparagus in season, or once with a wonderful hollandaise sauce. Then there were vegetable broths with little semolina dumplings, roasted red peppers, rice, salads, and vegetable stews once a week. It wasn't like we were given a spoonful or a forkful, we were given plates of the stuff to eat." After lunch, Hitler and his commanders attended a second military briefing, which lasted until 5 p.m., time for tea. The Führer, in fact, asked for his 4 secretaries to join him for tea, coffee, and pastries, encouraging the young women to gorge themselves with cake. Hitler and his young employees indulged in sweets and banter until 7 p.m., time for dinner. After the meal, Hitler would rejoin his generals in a conference room for a lengthy evening situation report. Typist Christa Schroeder remembers how these sessions would drag on forever as the dictator discussed strategy with the officers, or more often than not subjected them to endless bouts of verbal diarrhea. Quoting her, "The sessions last a ridiculously long time, and one is by then, if not actually ready to drop, at least enervated and bereft of energy." The quote ends. All the military discussions, however long and rambling, had to be transcribed verbatim on Hitler's orders. This task was carried out by a team of at least 24 stenographers who had their own dedicated barracks. These stenographers worked in pairs, taking shifts so as to cover the entirety of the long working hours. This type of clerical work was of fundamental importance to accurately capture and convey Hitler's orders for the conduct of the war on the Eastern Front. And accuracy was key here, as the Führer's communication style was not exactly straightforward. As pointed out by his valet Heinz Linge, when thinking aloud, he would bring to light individual problems from all directions and make simple procedures into the most insoluble problems. He presented each position in a way that an uninitiated listener who was not familiar with his methods could often not know what he actually wanted. He would wander off the subject, talk about irrelevancies, and confuse people who were following his explanations closely. Mostly, he left it to his listeners to put the right weight on a thing and so understand what it was he'd been talking about. Even the military, who were normally used to terse and clear commands, sometimes had to endure an hour or two of explanations, and they would still be uncertain what he really wanted. The quote ends. Whether those officers were certain or not, they had to convey the boss's orders to the front. To do so, they made good use of a sophisticated communication system. It consisted of a telephone exchange, a telegraphy post, and an army signals unit employing encrypted telex and radio communications. This unit consisted of 36 men working 24/7 on a 3-shift rota. The signals unit must have been the most hardworking team at the Wolf's Lair, but they also enjoyed some perks, at least according to former member Karl Otto Wendel. Quoting him, "The signals room felt unpleasant and stuffy. Those who worked here for a long time suffered from cardiovascular disease. Smoking was also popular and excessive drinking of black coffee too. We received coffee as well as excellent food, good wines and cognacs from the casino staff and some important personalities of the Wolf's Lair, who in this way repaid us for private, in principle prohibited phone calls to their friends or families." Besides these radio operators on the brink of a heart attack, it appears that everybody else at the Wolf's Lair enjoyed a manageable workload thanks to a well-structured routine. Well, at least for the first 6 months in operations. In December 1941, Hitler dismissed Marshal von Brauchitsch as commander-in-chief of the Land Army and replaced him with, well, himself. These extra duties completely threw the routine out of the window, not just for the dictator, but for the entire staff at Wolf's Lair. The Führer did not wake up before noon. Lunch could be served as late as 6 p.m., and the evening situation conference did not start before 9 p.m. As per the beloved tea and cake sessions, these started after midnight and ended with Hitler falling asleep on a sofa with everybody else sitting in silence lest they wake him up. As the war progressed, the German armed forces experienced progressively heavy setbacks, especially on the Eastern Front. This contributed to an increasingly gloomy and desperate atmosphere at the Wolf's Lair, but some residents always found time to enjoy a life of leisure. Chief amongst them was Hitler's chief secretary, Martin Bormann. Known for his luxurious lifestyle in Berlin, Bormann managed to replicate it in Rastenburg. He had his own private house located next to a more secure bunker, which he kept always stocked with the finest foods and wines. Far from being greedy, Bormann made sure to share this wealth with his own secretaries, all young and attractive girls. Mrs. Gerda Bormann was well aware of her husband's affairs at the Lair, but took the philandering with philosophy. To quote her, "My husband needs it." Other residents at the Lair enjoyed more simple pleasures, such as the kino or movie theater on site. Shows took place every night at 8:15 and 10:15 p.m., always preceded by the propaganda newsreels. The stock of available films was exhausted eventually, and the bored spectators had to make do with old silent movies. One of the military adjutants was in charge of reading out loud the captions, but Hitler, always the micromanager, would butt in to correct the script, making rewrites on the fly. For the more sporty types, the nearby Lake Moise offered a much welcome vent from the stress of fighting the Soviets. The lake was equipped with a sandy beach, a bathing jetty, a diving platform, a refreshment hut, and even changing rooms. Surprisingly, the young men of the Wehrmacht would be joined by local girls from Rastenburg who made it to the supposedly secret area without any restriction. This shows that the tight security measures at the Wolf's Lair were formidable on paper, but could actually be breached. The HQ, in fact, was the backdrop to the assassination attempt, which arguably came closer to eliminating the Führer than anything else. That was the plot carried out on July the 20th, 1944 by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg. Stauffenberg and his allies had been inspired by General von Tresckow, active on the Eastern Front. Despite their nationalism, these officers were disgusted by the Nazi atrocities committed against civilians, Jews, and other undesirables. Moreover, they were disillusioned with Hitler's increasingly erratic and desperate conduct of the war. Even before the big plot, Stauffenberg and his friends made several attempts to put the hit in Hitler at the Wolf's Lair. The first scheme took place on November 16, 1943, when Major Boucher was expected to perform a sort of catwalk, displaying new winter uniforms. Boucher may have looked like the stereotypical Aryan Superman, tall, blonde, blue-eyed, and ridiculously good-looking, but the man despised the Nazis and volunteered to blow himself up in Hitler's presence. But a British bombing raid blew up the train carrying the uniform, and the fashion show was postponed to February 1944. By then, Boucher had lost a leg in battle. A new model/assassin, Captain von Kleist, volunteered for the action, but the dire situation in the East prompted Hitler's aides to cancel the event. But luck was on Stauffenberg's side. The colonel had lost one eye and one arm in battle and was thus assigned to a desk job, Chief of Staff of the Reserve Army, a role which would require him to hold briefings with the Führer. On July the 15th, Stauffenberg was invited to the Wolf's Lair, the meeting which he attended with fellow conspirator General Steiff. Tucked into his briefcase, Stauffenberg carried his weapon of choice, 2 kilos of plastic explosive. The colonel was a decorated war hero with the battle scars to prove his dedication to the Reich. As such, he breezed through security controls at the Wolf's Lair. But this attempt failed completely due to a misunderstanding. Stauffenberg wished to eliminate Hitler, Himmler, and Goering all in one go, but the latter two officials were not at the meeting. The colonel slipped out of the conference room and rushed to the communications barrack. There he placed a call to Berlin seeking instructions from his co-conspirators. The mission was still a go, but when the colonel returned to the briefing bunker, his briefcase was gone. Luckily, though, it was in the safe hands of General Steiff, who had also left the room. But the conference was drawing to a close, and Stauffenberg had lost the occasion to ignite the fuse of his bomb. Stauffenberg was summoned again on July the 20th. Thus, he flew to Rastenburg with conspirator Werner von Haiften carrying 2 explosive devices in his briefcase. The plotter's plan was to attend a meeting with Hitler at 1 p.m., but the conference was brought forward to 12:30. With only 5 minutes to spare, Stauffenberg and Haiften discreetly managed to activate only 1 bomb and walk towards the meeting barracks. Along the way, one Major Friend offered to carry his briefcase, which Stauffenberg accepted. This simple act of kindness saved Hitler's life. As they entered the cabin, Friend placed the briefcase carrying the bomb under the large conference table against one of its thick wooden supports. The fuse was running only 10 minutes before the blast. Stauffenberg had to slip out of the room just moments before the explosion, leave the Wolf's Lair complex, and return to Berlin so as to activate Valkyrie, a plan designed to neutralize the SS and take over the government. And so he did. The colonel calmly walked out with an excuse, reunited with von Haiften, and drove out of the HQ. At 12:42, the bomb went off. Stenographer Heinz Buschholz witnessed the explosion, remembering it as, quote, a clap of thunder connected with a bright yellow flash and ever-increasing thick smoke. Glass and wood splintered through the air. The large table on which the situation maps had been spread out and around which the participants were standing collapsed. After a few seconds of silence, shouts and screams of pain arose. 4 officers attending the meeting had died, but an uncanny bit of luck saved the Führer's life. The thick oak support of the table had deflected the blast of the explosion. In Hitler's own words, the heavy table leg diverted the explosion. The stenotypist sitting near me had both legs blown off. I had extraordinary luck. If the explosion had happened in the bunker and not in the wooden hut, nobody would have survived it. But haven't I always anticipated that happening? News of Hitler's survival spread to Berlin, despite the conspirators' best attempts to carry out the Valkyrie plan. Major Otto Ernst Riemer, commander of the Grossdeutschland's Guard Battalion in Berlin, took the initiative to surround the Bendler block, an office building used as a base by the plotters. After an intense firefight, Stauffenberg, von Haiften, and other conspirators were marched into the courtyard of the block and executed by firing squad. Other members of the anti-Nazi plot were hanged in the Plotzensie prison with piano wires, a macabre scene that was captured on film. According to Albert Speer, the scene was projected at the Wolf's Lair movie theater to the Führer's delight. Quoting him, Hitler loved the film and had it shown over and over again. A direct consequence of the Stauffenberg plot was the tightening of security measures. Mere hours after the bomb had gone off, units of the elite Leibstandart SS Adolf Hitler Division arrived at the base, sealing off Security Zone 1 and guarding all key buildings. The role of regular army units in protecting the Wolf's Lair was greatly diminished in favor of the more loyal and fanatical SS. These troopers were now ordered to thoroughly search the briefcases of all officers in the presence of the Führer, but this did not prevent a further assassination attempt from taking place. This was carried out by Hitler's ear, nose, and throat specialist, Dr. Geising. His services were sorely needed as the Führer's health had progressively declined after the Stauffenberg blast, despite the superficial wounds initially suffered. The dictator had become increasingly withdrawn and irritable and could no longer stand the incessant noise generated by the construction work, which never really stopped. Thus, to calm his nerves, Geising was summoned to administer regular doses of liquid cocaine. On October 1st, 1944, Geising found himself alone with the dictator while administering the treatment. Suddenly, Hitler's eyes fluttered, a sign that he might be overdosing. On the spur of the moment, Geising decided to douse him with more cocaine and get rid of him for good. As he wrote in his diary, "At that moment, I did not want such a man to exist and exercise the power of life and death in his purely subjective manner." But as he was pouring the second dose, Hitler's aide Heinz Linge walked into the room. The doctor was startled and did not carry out his deed. As Hitler's health deteriorated, so did the general situation on the Eastern Front and at the Wolf's Lair. The Red Army's steamroller moved closer and closer to the base, shaken every day and every night by the air raid sirens. By October 1944, the Soviets had reached the border with Eastern Prussia, and Hitler agreed that he had to move back to Berlin. Even so, 2,000 workers from Organisation Todt were still toiling away at the site, pouring more reinforced concrete and laying out more secure bunkers. As General Walter Arlamont remembered, the concrete on the great towers of the Wolf's Lair had hardly dried when Hitler left for the final time on the morning of the 20th of November 1944, with the Soviets closing in. On the 22nd, Field Marshal Keitel initiated Operations Inseltsprung, a self-destruct operation to prevent the HQ from falling into Soviet hands. The order was executed by Generals Eduard Hauser and Alfred Jacob on the 24th and 25th of January 1945. The generals employed 8 tons of TNT, not in total, but 8 tons to destroy every single bunker. The enormous blast sent slabs of concrete flying. They cracked the ice on Lake Moisy and even damaged the houses in Parch, a village some 2 kilometers away. Hauser and Jacob also took care of destroying the nearby railway facilities and burned all documents archived in the Lair. 2 days later, the Red Army arrived, finding an eerie sight. The once mighty complex was now completely empty of human presence. It was silent and utterly destroyed. Today, the area is entirely safe, and the Wolf's Lair is a popular tourist attraction. You can find their website at wolfschanze.pl/en for the English version if you plan to visit. There is even a hotel inside one of the barracks once housing Hitler's bodyguards. The former HQ is also frequently visited by amateur archaeologists, such as those belonging to Fundacja Latebra, a team based in Gdansk. In February 2024, the team was shocked to find 4 human skeletons buried under the floor of a bunker once home to none other than Marshal Hermann Goering. Forensic analysis found that the 4 skeletons belonged to 3 adults and a baby. According to Piotrek Banaskiewicz, one of the archaeologists, the first skeleton found presented visible deformities, including, quote, a displaced jaw, a curved spine, and a disfigured skull that didn't have a visible eye socket, indicating whoever it was suffered from health issues. None of the skeletons presented traces of clothing or personal belongings, meaning that the bodies were probably stripped before their burial. Even more intriguing, the hands and feet of all the skeletons were absent. Perhaps they'd simply decomposed, but it is possible that their extremities had been amputated. The Guardian newspaper speculated whether Goering was aware of the presence of these bodies or if they'd been buried after the war. Another possibility is that the 4 individuals were victims of a mass killing not necessarily carried out by the Nazis. On May the 8th, Assistant Professor Daniel Tiller's Department of History at the University of Krakow reported that Polish prosecutors had, quote, announced that their investigation had found the remains most likely came from 4 people, 3 of them middle-aged men and the other a child of undetermined gender. The prosecutors also stated that the bodies did not present injuries indicating a criminal cause of death. As such, they, quote, announced that they will not proceed with a criminal investigation into the remains. While the remains can be dated to the period around the Second World War, it has been impossible to determine the cause of death. Zenon Petrovitz, head of the Srakowo Forest District, in which the Wolf's Lair is located, suggested that the mysterious 4, quote, could have been victims of Soviet troops who were stationed there after the defeat of Nazi Germany. Another possibility is that they were accidental victims of landmines that remained in the area for a decade after the war. At the time of writing this episode, the conundrum is likely to never be solved, but we hope that this macabre mystery will not deter our history-loving audience from visiting such an important relic of World War II, a memento to the madness of a genocidal regime and the banality that too often accompanied its evil deeds.